The empty lot behind the house. The first time Sarah witnessed someone's death was over a year ago, when she was still living in England. Watching someone die means seeing them transition suddenly from life to the world beyond. The person was Mr. Johnson, who lived 3 houses down from Sarah on the same quiet street in London. Sarah wasn't particularly close to him just because he was a neighbor. People tend to lead their own lives and rarely cross paths. Besides, Mr. Johnson was much older than Sarah. In fact, if tradition held, she should have addressed him as uncle. But the reason Sarah was familiar with him was because he was a bus driver. On the route from Sarah's house to her workplace, she encountered him every morning, without fail. There was a time when buses were a busy mode of public transport, always packed with passengers. However, as England's economy grew, more and more people began to buy cars, and motorcycles became more common. The bus began to lose its appeal, growing slower and less popular as the streets filled with traffic. Only people without other means of transport, like Sarah, were left relying on the bus. The bus was often empty, and when Mr. Johnson saw Sarah bored, he would always greet her with casual small talk, even though drivers weren't really allowed to chat while on duty. Sarah would return the greeting and sit in a nearby seat to exchange pleasantries and make the journey to work less monotonous. They usually talked about simple things, though occasionally, if something unusual happened on their street, they would have something new to discuss. Mr. Johnson lived alone, sharing a house with his brother and treating his brother's family as his own. At 45 years old, he had a weathered, thoughtful face with a tinge of melancholy. His dark skin and long, messy hair gave him a slightly unkempt appearance, though Sarah always found his constant smile endearing, despite his yellow-stained teeth from heavy smoking. He was addicted to cigarettes, always carrying a pack of the locally made Black Leaf, a brand few people smoked. When traffic slowed, he would sometimes step out for a quick smoke, puffing a few drags before climbing back behind the wheel. One morning, like any other, Sarah sat in her usual seat behind Mr. Johnson, telling him about some drama happening in her neighborhood. The bus was moving smoothly when, without warning, it veered off the road, jumped onto the curb, and crashed into a tree. The bus stopped abruptly, but Mr. Johnson slumped over the steering wheel, the horn blaring continuously. The wide sidewalk and the large tree stopped the bus from hitting any pedestrians or crashing into a building. Passengers stood up in alarm, shaking Mr. Johnson and calling out to him, "Are you okay, Mr. Johnson? Wake up!" But despite their efforts, he didn't respond. People began to realize something was seriously wrong. They slowly disembarked to find other transport, afraid of being late for work. Only a few curious regulars stayed, including Sarah, who helped lift Mr. Johnson upright. As soon as they did, the horn stopped. His head fell to one side, his face ashen, mouth slightly open, and his eyes wide, staring blankly into space. It was clear he had passed away. People whispered that he must have had a heart attack or been struck by a sudden illness, but no one could believe he was truly gone. Sarah looked around, hoping someone had smelling salts or anything to revive him, but deep down, she knew he was beyond saving. That day marked the first time Sarah had ever witnessed such a sudden and tragic death. Little did she know, the memories of that day would follow her far beyond England, haunting her in ways she could never have imagined. After Mr. Johnson's death, Sarah couldn't shake the image of his lifeless face from her mind. A month later, she moved to Canada to start a new life, sponsored by her older brother, Paul. He lived in a recently developed suburb on the outskirts of Toronto with his wife, Claire, and their teenage daughter, Emily. Sarah was given a small bedroom on the ground floor, right next to the backyard, with a window that overlooked an empty, overgrown lot. It was a quiet place, a bit too quiet for Sarah, who still missed the hustle and bustle of London. As the weeks passed, Sarah's brother, Paul, began pushing her to find work. He understood that she needed time to settle in, but Claire was more impatient, often reminding Sarah that she needed to start contributing. Paul eventually helped Sarah find a job at a 24-hour donut shop downtown. The only catch was that the job was on the night shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Paul reassured her that this was temporary, and once she gained some experience, she could switch to the day shift. On the night of her first shift, Sarah was nervous. She hadn't worked nights before, and her mind was still troubled by memories of Mr. Johnson's death. Paul gave her detailed instructions on how to take the bus to the shop, explaining that she would have to walk a fair distance to catch the bus, then transfer at the metro before reaching her final destination. The walk to the bus stop was long and lonely, with few streetlights to brighten the way. By the time she arrived, there was only one other person waiting, an elderly woman sitting on a bench inside the bus shelter. Sarah sat beside the woman, glancing nervously down the street. After a few minutes, she spotted the bus approaching in the distance. She stood up, relieved to see the familiar headlights, and waited as the bus slowed to a stop in front of them. But as the bus doors opened, Sarah froze in place. Sitting behind the wheel was Mr. Johnson. His face was the same as she remembered, ashen, with a faint blue tint to his skin. His hair, once dark and unruly, now seemed even more lifeless, as if it had been combed by death itself. He stared straight ahead, unblinking, his mouth twisted into a faint, unsettling smile. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't move. The elderly woman stepped onto the bus without hesitation, but Sarah stayed rooted to the spot. She could barely breathe, her mind racing. How could this be? Mr. Johnson had died in England. She had been there, had seen him buried. There was no way he could be here, driving a bus in Canada. Panic surged through her as she stumbled backward, dropping her bag. She turned and ran, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Behind her, the bus doors closed with a hiss, and the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night. By the time Sarah reached her brother's house, she was out of breath, her heart still racing. She burst through the door, startling Paul, who had been sitting at the kitchen table. He looked up in alarm as Sarah collapsed into a chair, her face pale and covered in sweat. "What happened? Why are you back? Did something go wrong at work?" Paul asked, his voice filled with concern. Sarah shook her head, unable to find the words. She took a deep breath and finally managed to say, "I saw him, Paul. I saw Mr. Johnson driving the bus." Paul stared at her in disbelief. "Mr. Johnson? The man who died back in London? That's impossible, Sarah. You must have imagined it." "I didn't imagine it," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. "It was him. His face. It was just like the day he died. I know what I saw." Claire entered the room, overhearing the conversation. "What's going on?" she asked, frowning. "Why aren't you at work?" Paul explained what Sarah had said, and Claire's face twisted in disbelief. "Come on, Sarah. Ghosts don't drive buses. You probably just had a bad dream. You need to get some rest." Sarah didn't argue. She knew what she had seen, but it was clear that no one would believe her. The image of Mr. Johnson's cold, lifeless face haunted her as she went to bed that night, too terrified to sleep. The next day, Sarah considered taking a different bus route, one that Paul suggested might be safer. But the thought of stepping onto any bus filled her with dread. That evening, as she prepared to head out again, she resolved to leave earlier, hoping to avoid the strange encounter from the previous night. As she approached the bus stop, her heart pounded in her chest. The street was eerily quiet, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When the next bus arrived, she forced herself to step on. The driver was a middle-aged man she had never seen before. Relieved, she sat down in one of the seats, but the uneasy feeling never left her. For weeks, Sarah avoided the 9:30 p.m. bus. Every time she saw a bus approaching, her heart skipped a beat, half expecting to see Mr. Johnson's ghostly figure behind the wheel. Though she never saw him again, the memory of that night continued to haunt her, lingering like a shadow in the back of her mind. What had she really seen that night, and why did it feel like something was still following her, watching her every move? Deep down, Sarah knew that Mr. Johnson's spirit hadn't been laid to rest, and no matter how far she ran, the past would always find a way to catch up. Sarah tried to push the memory of that haunting night out of her mind, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger with time. She returned to work, took different bus routes, and did everything she could to avoid thinking about Mr. Johnson. Yet, every night, as she walked through the quiet streets or sat on the empty bus, she felt as if someone, or something, was watching her. The unease clung to her, refusing to let go. One night, after her shift at the donut shop, Sarah found herself working late into the morning. The hours dragged on, and by the time she finished, the early morning light had begun to creep into the sky. It was just past 5 a.m. when she finally locked up and began her journey home. Exhausted, she didn't think twice about catching the earliest bus. The streets were unusually empty, the dawn breaking through the pale fog that hung low over the city. Sarah shivered in the cold as she stood alone at the bus stop, her breath visible in the crisp air. She glanced down the street and saw the familiar headlights of the bus approaching. Without much thought, she stepped onto the bus when it arrived, fumbling with her fare as she glanced up at the driver. Her blood ran cold. There, sitting behind the wheel, was Mr. Johnson. His expression was the same as before. His pale face, lifeless eyes, and thin smile sent shivers down her spine. Sarah froze, paralyzed by fear. The bus was nearly empty, with only a few passengers scattered throughout. Her mind screamed for her to get off the bus, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only stare at him, wide-eyed and trembling. Mr. Johnson's head turned slowly toward her. His hollow eyes met hers, and for a moment time seemed to stop. His lips moved, forming words Sarah could barely make out. "Why did you leave?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her heart racing, but her body wouldn't obey her instincts to flee. His voice, though faint, echoed in her ears, soft and eerie, like the wind rustling through a cemetery. "You left me behind." The words sent a wave of cold terror through Sarah's entire body. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How was this possible? Mr. Johnson had died, and she had been there. She had seen him buried. Suddenly, the lights on the bus flickered. The air grew colder, and Sarah felt the weight of something heavy pressing down on her chest. The few passengers on the bus seemed oblivious, staring blankly ahead as if trapped in some ghostly trance. Sarah's hand shot to the cord, pulling the stop request frantically. She didn't care where she was. She just needed to get off the bus. The driver, however, made no move to stop. The bus rolled on through the empty streets, ignoring her pleas. Panic consumed her. She rushed toward the door, banging on it, desperate to escape. The bus slowed, but as Sarah looked over her shoulder, she saw Mr. Johnson's gaze still fixed on her, unblinking. His voice came again, a whisper in the wind. "You can't run. I'll always be here." The bus finally came to a halt, the doors opening with a hiss. Sarah bolted out onto the street, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she was several blocks away. The image of Mr. Johnson's ghostly face burned into her mind. When she finally stopped, her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto a park bench, trembling uncontrollably. The world around her seemed eerily still, the early morning light casting long shadows across the empty streets. The only sound was her own ragged breathing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She couldn't deny it any longer. Mr. Johnson was haunting her. Whether it was her guilt or something more supernatural, she didn't know. But one thing was certain: she couldn't escape him. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Sarah sat there, staring blankly ahead, trying to shake the feeling that she was being watched. The chill in the air lingered, and even though the world had returned to its normal rhythm, Sarah knew her life had changed. She was no longer just haunted by memories. She was being followed by the ghost of a man who had unfinished business with her. The next day, she decided she couldn't keep running. She had to confront whatever it was that connected her to Mr. Johnson. She needed to find a way to put his spirit to rest, once and for all. But how do you help a ghost who refuses to let go? That night, Sarah made her decision. She packed a small bag, knowing she would need to return to the place where it all began. Back to England, back to the street where Mr. Johnson had lived, and back to the moment where their fates had become entwined. It was the only way she could hope to find peace, and perhaps give Mr. Johnson the closure he needed. But deep down, Sarah feared that even returning to the place of his death wouldn't be enough to free her from the spirit that now haunted her every step. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly safe. After the incident with Mr. Johnson on the bus, things had only grown more terrifying. Now, strange things were happening in her new home, leaving her constantly on edge. Every sound in the night sent her heart racing, and every shadow seemed to hide a lurking presence. It was around midnight, and Sarah found herself lying awake once more. She had been tossing and turning for hours, unable to shake the sense of dread that clung to her. The house was too quiet, and the darkness too deep. She thought about leaving the lights on, but she was too tired to get up. She shut her eyes tightly, trying to force herself to sleep. That's when she heard it, the low growl of the neighbor's dog outside her window. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, and it made her blood run cold. The dog's growl grew louder, followed by the frantic scratching of its claws against the back wall of the house. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the fear rising inside her, a cold, suffocating wave. The dog's growling intensified, and soon it began barking, louder and more aggressively than ever before. It was as though something or someone was out there, provoking the animal. Sarah's throat tightened as she listened to the frantic barks, followed by the eerie sound of scratching against the window. She froze, clutching the edge of her blanket, too terrified to move. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something outside was trying to get in. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the barking stopped. Silence settled over the house, but it was far from comforting. Moments later, Sarah heard it again, the unmistakable hum of an engine. But it wasn't just any engine. It was the distinct rumble of a bus, creeping closer and closer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. How could there be a bus here? There were no streets behind the house, only the empty lot. The engine grew louder, the sound filling her ears as if the bus was driving right past her window. She imagined Mr. Johnson sitting behind the wheel, his pale, ghostly face turned toward her, watching her from the dark. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled the blanket tighter around her, squeezing her eyes shut to block out the image. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, and Sarah shot up in bed. She had left the lights off. She could hear the soft footsteps of someone moving through the house. Desperate for comfort, Sarah thought of running upstairs to join her niece, Emily, but she didn't want to wake her. She decided to stay put, lying on the floor with her blanket, hoping to calm herself enough to sleep. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find Paul, her brother, standing over her with a look of concern. He had been awake for a while, noticing that his sister had slept in the hallway. "Didn't want to sleep downstairs, did you?" he asked, his voice gentle but teasing. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes, feeling the fatigue weigh down on her. "I couldn't," she admitted. "I'm sorry, Paul. Last night was strange again." Paul sighed, clearly concerned, but he didn't press the issue. He headed to the kitchen to make coffee while Sarah tried to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. Later, Sarah convinced Paul to step outside with her. She had to know if there were any signs of the strange activity from the night before. They walked to the back of the house, and sure enough, there were deep scratch marks on the wall where the neighbor's dog had clawed at it. The marks were fresh, deep, and unmistakable. "See," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "It wasn't just in my head. Something's happening." Paul knelt down to inspect the marks. "It's weird," he admitted, "but maybe the dog was just spooked. Dogs do that sometimes." Sarah shook her head. "No, it wasn't just the dog. I heard a bus right behind the house. There's no road there, Paul. How can a bus be driving through the lot?" Paul stood up, frowning. "That doesn't make any sense, Sarah. There's no bus. You must have imagined it." Sarah wanted to argue, but deep down, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. She had to know the truth, and she wasn't going to stop until she did. That night, Sarah made a request. "Paul, I need you to come with me to the bus stop tonight. I have to see it for myself. If it's not Mr. Johnson driving the bus, then maybe I can finally move on." Paul hesitated, but seeing how distressed his sister was, he agreed. "Okay, I'll come with you," he said, "but I promise you it's not him. It's just your mind playing tricks on you." They spent the rest of the day trying to keep things normal, but the thought of what might happen that night lingered heavily over Sarah.